Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I often heard that even the strongest marriages can turn into routine over the years, but I never thought it would happen to me. Grayson had been my rock. We had been through a lot, and I always thought we were special. We weren't the type to succumb to everyday problems or forget about romance. But time took its toll, and more often, I found myself thinking that the spark between us had vanished. Day after day, the same scenario repeated. Work, home, occasional weekend trips. Everything seemed to run on a schedule. It didn't seem like a big deal, but something inside me was screaming, "This is not what you want. You deserve more. Will it always be like this?" I asked myself this question every night, falling asleep next to Grayson, who either didn't notice or pretended not to notice my inner turmoil. I loved him, but at the same time, I felt like I was losing myself. One evening, sitting with a cup of tea in the kitchen, I shared my thoughts with my friend Rachel, who, without hesitation, suggested a solution: fitness. She spoke with such passion, describing how it had changed her life, that I realized this was my chance to distract myself and engage in something new. Maybe the workouts would not only improve my physical shape, but also restore the confidence I had been lacking in recent years. The next day, I signed up for a fitness club not far from my house. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. I walked inside, breathing in the fresh, clean air. The modern equipment, mirrors reflecting every movement, and energetic people around. All of it made me momentarily forget my anxiety. But what caught my attention the most was him. His name was Declan. Tall, athletic, with a confidence that seemed to fill the air around him. His eyes were bright and intense when they met mine. Something inside me froze at that moment. I couldn't explain this feeling, but there was an immediate tension between us, the kind that is impossible to ignore, but hard to understand. "Hi, are you new here?" His voice was deep, almost mesmerizing. I nodded, a bit taken aback by the sudden spark inside me. "Great, I'm Declan, your trainer. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." I smiled, trying to hide my awkwardness. It was so strange. I had come here to focus on myself, on the workouts, but suddenly my mind was clouded by something else. The feeling of interest in a man I had just met was inappropriate and unexpected. I took a deep breath and decided to focus on the workouts, as I had planned. The first workouts went smoothly. I worked on myself, trying not to pay attention to Declan, although his presence became more and more noticeable. Every time he approached me to correct my technique or offer advice, I felt my pulse quicken. Each time he leaned in to help with an exercise, his proximity made my body tremble with something I couldn't control. I knew I shouldn't think about this. It was just fitness, and he was my trainer. All of this was part of his job. But one day, I caught myself looking forward to seeing him more than I cared to admit. In those moments, I asked myself, what's happening to me? Why do I react to him this way? One day after a workout, tired but satisfied, I sat down on a bench to rest. Declan approached and sat down next to me. "How do you like the workouts?" he asked, wiping his forehead with a towel. His voice sounded light and casual, but there was something else in his eyes that made me tense. "Everything's great. I feel much better." I smiled, but couldn't stop the light blush that suddenly flared up on my cheeks. "Glad to hear it. You're making great progress." I felt his gaze linger on me for a second longer than necessary. In that moment, something clicked inside me. Something irresistible that made my heart beat faster. "Thanks!" I quickly stood up, trying to escape from that gaze, from the tension that was starting to weigh on me. Thoughts raced through my mind. "I'm married. This is wrong. It's just fitness, nothing more." But I knew I would have to deal with it somehow. How long could I ignore what was starting to grow inside me? As I left the gym, I turned for a moment and noticed Declan watching me. I felt something stir inside me. It was the first time I realized that my workouts at the fitness club might turn into something more than just a way to escape the routine. Every time I returned home after a workout, it felt like my body wasn't as tired as I expected. Instead, it seemed to be filled with new energy. This strange sense of vitality stayed with me even when I lay down next to Grayson. His breathing, steady and calm, usually lulled me to sleep, but now I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind filled with thoughts that had nothing to do with my husband. I couldn't get Declan out of my head. He was everywhere. In my thoughts in the morning when I washed my face, during workouts when I'd catch his gaze through the mirror, and even at home when I tried to focus on everyday tasks. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue, or perhaps to the excitement of something new. After all, these workouts were something fresh for me. But the more I tried to justify it, the harder it became to ignore the growing feeling inside. Declan was special. There was no denying it. It wasn't just his appearance and confidence that set him apart, but the way he interacted with me. The attention he gave me seemed too personal for the usual relationship between trainer and client. I noticed it. It was as if he could see me, my state, my inner struggle. And every time he said something encouraging or made a joke, I felt that there was an invisible connection between us. That evening, lying in bed, I remembered the last day at the fitness club. It wasn't just another workout. It was something more. When Declan approached to correct my form during an exercise, his hand lingered on my waist a little longer than necessary. I might have thought it was just my imagination, but no, it was too real. His touch made me hold my breath, and I felt my pulse quicken, as if we were on the verge of something deeper than just a simple workout. At the time, I turned away and acted like nothing had happened, but something inside me had changed. The next day, heading back to the gym, I tried to convince myself that it was all just in my head, that I was overreacting. I was married, and he was just a trainer. We were both adults, and things like this didn't happen. But when I walked into the club and saw him again, my doubts evaporated. He looked at me in a way no one ever had. That look was so deep, it took my breath away. "Hey, Lainey, you look great," he said with a smile so genuine that I felt something inside me melt. "Thanks," I replied, trying to appear calm, though inside I was a mess. We started the workout, but everything was different. I couldn't concentrate on the exercises. Every step he took, every move, every glance felt too close, too personal. I could feel his attention on me more than ever before. He stood too near, his hands brushing against my skin, seemingly by accident, but it happened too often to be accidental. During a break, I sat down on a bench, taking a few deep breaths to calm my thoughts. But my eyes kept finding him. I felt something inexplicable building inside me, something I'd been trying to suppress for weeks. And then he was there again. Declan sat down next to me, as if we were just old friends, but the tension in the air was palpable. He was too close. His scent, his warmth, it was all too overwhelming. "You're doing great," he said, nodding toward the machines. "You're getting stronger." "Thanks," I replied, trying not to meet his gaze, but my hands had already begun to tremble. "Are you okay?" His voice was sincere, but there was something more in it, something that made me feel both uneasy and drawn to him. "Yeah, just tired, I guess," I smiled, trying to hide my nervousness, but he clearly saw that something was off with me. He looked at me with a gaze that pierced through, as if he could see what I was hiding even from myself. "If you ever need help or support, just let me know. I'm always here." His words sounded simple, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore. We fell silent, and the tension thickened between us like a dense fog. I knew the boundaries we were crossing were fragile. It was wrong, but I couldn't turn away from it. The next day after the workout, I once again felt that strange surge of energy. I couldn't stop thinking about Declan. I found myself thinking about him even while sitting in the kitchen with Grayson. These thoughts became obsessive, and it frightened me. I tried not to dwell on them, but as soon as I closed my eyes, his face, his gaze, his touch came to mind. Declan was more than just a trainer. He awakened something in me, something forgotten, something I had long lost in my marriage. In his eyes, I saw passion. In his touch, I felt the promise of something more. But I knew this was a dangerous game, and despite everything, I had to decide: stop or go further. With each passing day, his attention to me became more and more evident. He began spending more time with me than with his other clients. He stayed close, giving me advice I didn't necessarily need. Every look he gave me was filled with something I couldn't explain, but it pulled me toward him even more. But the strangest thing was that I started noticing him even when I wasn't at the gym. I caught myself thinking about him at the most unexpected moments, while making breakfast, reading a book, or just sitting in silence. This wasn't just a crush anymore. It was becoming something bigger than I was ready to admit. When Declan started suggesting private sessions outside of the regular schedule, I hesitated at first, but eventually I agreed. It seemed like an innocent offer, but deep down, I knew there was something more behind it. We both felt it. That evening, the gym was empty. All the clients had long since left, leaving the two of us alone in the massive space. We had already done several such sessions, and each one had grown more intense, but tonight felt different. I sensed it from the very beginning. He stood closer than usual while I was doing one of the exercises. My muscles were tense, but not just from the physical effort. I could feel his gaze burning into me, and I couldn't focus on my breathing like he had taught me. "You've gotten so much stronger," he said softly, his voice carrying something deep, something that made my heart race. I looked at him, trying to force a smile, but something inside me had already shifted. This wasn't just a workout anymore. We had crossed the line between a trainer and a client long ago. "Thanks," I replied, feeling a surge of emotions rise within me, emotions I had been trying so hard to suppress. Declan was standing too close. His breathing matched mine, deep and uneven, and I sensed that something was happening between us, something invisible yet undeniably real. I could no longer ignore it. "Lainey," he said my name, and at that moment, I knew this evening would change everything. I didn't have time to respond. In the next second, he moved even closer, and our lips met. It was the most innocent kiss, but it felt so significant, so decisive. My head spun, and I forgot everything. I wasn't thinking about Grayson, or about how wrong this was. In that moment, there was only Declan, and this indescribable feeling that consumed me entirely. The kiss was brief, but that moment changed everything. I could no longer deny what was happening between us. We pulled away, both of us breathing heavily, and I saw in his eyes the same thing I was feeling: desire, passion, and fear. We both knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, but neither of us wanted to stop. I began, but I couldn't finish. The words were stuck in my throat, and I just stared at him, trying to figure out what to do next. "Lainey, he started, but he couldn't continue either. We stood there in silence, both of us realizing what had just happened. I quickly gathered my things and headed to the locker room. I needed space, some time to process what I was feeling. I felt both shattered and more alive than I had in years. My body was still burning from his touch, and I knew that this night would stay with me for a long time. When I stepped into the shower and turned on the water, the cool streams felt icy compared to the fire I felt inside. The water ran down my body, but it couldn't wash away the flood of emotions that had taken over me after that kiss. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, but all I could see was Declan's face. Suddenly, I heard the shower door creak open. I turned around and saw him, Declan, standing in the doorway. My heart stopped. He wasn't supposed to be here, but I knew this was inevitable. "Declan!" My words were barely audible over the sound of the water, but I knew he could hear me. He stepped forward, never taking his eyes off me. In that moment, there were no words between us, no excuses. I stood there, feeling the tension in the air grow even thicker. "I can't stop, Lainey," he whispered, and in his voice, I heard the same struggle I was feeling inside. I could have left, I could have stopped him, but I didn't. Every morning started the same way. I woke up next to Grayson, his breathing steady and calm, just as it always was. I watched him, and at that moment, guilt began to eat me up inside. I loved him, and that was true. But now, love seemed like something distant, something I couldn't hold on to. Every time I closed my eyes, instead of my husband, Declan's face appeared before me. This thought had haunted me since our kiss. I thought I could control my feelings, that I could leave it all behind in the gym. But the more I tried to resist, the stronger my pull towards Declan became. His image was so vivid in my mind that I couldn't concentrate on my responsibilities. My entire life seemed to revolve around those workouts, around his presence. It was madness. Sitting in the kitchen, I watched Grayson drink his morning coffee, completely unaware of what was going on inside me. He looked the same as always, but for me, everything had changed. I couldn't shake this feeling. I was torn between duty and desire, and every morning, I thought I could put an end to it, but each time I found myself weaker. Grayson seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil. He was completely absorbed in his work, his routine, and it created the illusion of stability in our marriage. But I knew it was a lie. I was deceiving him, deceiving myself, and that feeling gnawed at me from the inside. Every time I saw him, guilt washed over me. But then I thought of Declan. That day, when I went back to the gym, I felt especially down. Guilt and desire were two forces tearing me apart. But when I walked into the gym and saw Declan, it all seemed to dissolve. He stood at the entrance, his confidence, his gaze. All of it made me forget reality. "Lainey, good to see you." His voice was as low and confident as always, and I felt something inside me flip over once again. "Hi," I replied, trying to stay calm, but my body betrayed me in response to his presence. My heart raced, and I knew the situation was slipping out of control. We started the workout, but today, everything felt different. Declan became more insistent. He no longer tried to hide his feelings. His movements were more confident, his touches more frequent. I felt his tension, his passion, and it made me lose my composure. "You look tired, Lainey," he said, coming closer than necessary for the workout. "You need to relax a bit." I nodded, but couldn't reply. All my thoughts were about how I shouldn't be here, shouldn't be standing in front of him, but my body was saying the opposite. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to forget everything and be with him. When the workout ended, I was about to leave, but Declan stopped me. "Lainey, wait." His voice was firm, and I felt my heart stop. I turned around, trying to hide the anxiety that washed over me. He took a step closer, and the tension between us hung heavy once again. "I know what you're feeling," he said quietly, his gaze piercing through me. "You can't deny it." My breathing quickened. I didn't know what to say. He was right. I couldn't deny what was happening between us. It was stronger than me. "Declan, this is wrong," I began, but couldn't finish. The words felt empty. Everything I said made no sense, because my feelings screamed the opposite. He stepped even closer, and his hand brushed mine. The touch was light, almost innocent, but it took my breath away. "I can't let you go, Lainey." His voice was soft but filled with determination. "I think about you all the time." My heart clenched. These words, the ones I had feared hearing, were now spoken, and I didn't know what to do with them. I thought about him too, constantly, but it was wrong, and I knew we both had to stop before it went too far. "Declan, I'm married," I finally exhaled, but even those words couldn't stop the wave rising inside me. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't change anything. You feel it too, just like I do." My head spun from his closeness, from his words. I wanted to push him away, to run, but instead, I stood there. All I could do was fight with myself, but that battle already seemed lost. When I came home, Grayson greeted me with his usual smile. He knew nothing, suspected nothing. I felt like a monster. The guilt washed over me again with renewed strength, but the desire to see Declan was stronger. I couldn't forget him, couldn't get him out of my head. I tried to figure myself out, tried to understand what was pulling me so strongly to this man. It wasn't just physical passion, it was something more. He made me feel alive. He awakened something in me that I had lost long ago. There was danger in that, but also power. Meanwhile, Declan was becoming more persistent. He no longer hid his feelings, his attention was becoming more obvious, and I couldn't ignore him anymore. Every time I went to the gym, he was there, his gaze saying more than words. We both knew we were on the edge, but neither of us wanted to stop. I knew it was dangerous. I knew I was betraying Grayson, but every time I thought about ending it, something inside me pulled me back to Declan. The training session ended later than usual. The gym had emptied, and only Declan and I remained in the hall. My mind screamed at me that it was time to leave, that I should go now before it was too late, but my body wouldn't move. I felt the tension between us grow with every minute, as the air around us thickened with emotions we had both been trying to suppress for so long. "You did great today," he said, and there was something in his voice that held more than just a simple acknowledgement of my progress. I nodded, not daring to meet his eyes. I knew that one more glance could destroy everything, but it was useless. I could feel his gaze on me, his presence filling the space around me entirely. "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, but inside, I was burning up. Declan was standing too close, his breath barely grazing my skin, and I could feel my body responding to his nearness. This was wrong. I knew I was betraying Grayson, but all I could think about in that moment was how much I wanted to be closer to Declan. "Lainey?" His voice was soft, but it made my heart stop. I looked at him, and everything changed. In that instant, all my internal barriers crumbled. We didn't say a word, but our gazes spoke more than any words could. I knew I had to stop, that I had to leave, but instead, I took a step closer to him. Declan didn't move, but I could sense his hands trembling slightly with tension. Only a second remained between us. And that second shattered when he pulled me to him, and our lips met. It was explosive. Not just a simple kiss, but the release of all the emotions we had both been suppressing for so long. I felt his hands sliding down my body, our breaths merging into one rhythm. It was wrong, but at that moment, I couldn't fight anymore. I gave in to that kiss with a passion I hadn't felt in a long time. His lips were firm, yet gentle, and I couldn't stop. My head was spinning, my body burning from his touch. I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return, but still, I kept going. His hands gripped my waist tightly, and I realized I was at the mercy of my own desires. "Lainey!" His voice broke mid-sentence as I pulled away, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like it would burst from my chest. I took a step back, trying to regain control, but everything around me was spinning. I looked at him and saw in his eyes the same thing I felt: desire, passion, but also the realization that we had gone too far. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my words felt hollow. "I know." His response was just as brief as mine. We both knew it was wrong, but neither of us wanted to stop. He took a step towards me, and I felt my body tremble again from his closeness. I couldn't control myself. My heart was saying one thing, but my mind screamed another. I felt like I was on the verge of madness. Declan pulled me to him again, and our lips met once more. This time, the kiss was even more passionate, rougher, as if all our suppressed feelings had finally erupted. I couldn't think anymore, couldn't fight. I just gave in to the sensation, allowing myself to drown in it. His hands started to slide down my body, and I knew this was going too far, but I couldn't stop him. I felt my skin burning from his touch, my breathing becoming ragged. Everything else lost meaning. In that moment, there was only Declan and me. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point, I pulled away. My body was on edge, my heart racing uncontrollably, and I couldn't handle the overwhelming sensation that had taken over me. "I can't," I whispered, trying to regain control of the situation. Declan looked at me, his eyes full of the same desire, but also concern. We both knew that what had just happened had changed everything. I was married, and that fact buzzed in my head, reminding me of my obligations. But in that moment, desire had won. "Lainey, I don't want to stop this." His voice was low, filled with passion, and I couldn't respond. I knew I had gone too far, but I couldn't find the strength to stop. After I first allowed myself to cross the forbidden line, everything in my life changed. I could no longer look at the world the way I used to. Every time I woke up next to Grayson, waves of guilt washed over me, filling every thought. Yet, despite that, I couldn't stop. Every time I saw Declan, the whole world lost its meaning, and it was just the two of us. Our secret meetings, our glances, our touches, they turned into something far more dangerous than just a fleeting attraction. Declan and I started looking for any opportunity to spend time together outside the gym. It was no longer just quick kisses after workouts, but something far more risky and forbidden. We began meeting in secret, hiding our relationship from everyone. At first, it was quick encounters in the parking lot near the club after all the clients had left. But later, cafes on the outskirts of the city where no one could see us. Each time I headed to one of these meetings, my heart raced wildly. I knew I was betraying my husband, risking everything we had. But at that moment, all I could think about was Declan. His presence, his hands, his gaze, all of it pulled me toward him like a magnet. One day, he suggested we meet at a small cafe outside the city. We chose that place because it was quiet, and no one knew us there. I drove up in my car, my heart pounding in anticipation. When I walked inside, he was already sitting by the window, his gaze locking onto me the moment I entered. That look was filled with what I had come to know so well: passion, desire, but also the caution that always lingered between us. "Hi," he said softly as I sat down across from him. "Hi," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness, but we both knew it was impossible to conceal. We sat in silence for a few seconds, looking at each other. The tension between us was impossible to ignore. It was a moment when reality faded, and it was just the two of us. Every time I saw him, the fire inside me burned stronger. I could no longer hide what I felt, and every time I was near him, that feeling consumed me entirely. "I missed you," he finally said, leaning closer. His words were simple, but their meaning was much deeper. I felt something stir inside me. "I did too," I replied, trying to sound as calm as possible, but my heart was beating too fast to make it convincing. We sat there, barely touching our drinks, just enjoying the quiet and the fact that we could be together. But despite it all, the tension between us grew. I knew I wouldn't be able to hold back much longer. It was too strong, too magnetic. "We can't keep doing this for long," I whispered, realizing that those words meant more to me than to him. "It's too dangerous." Declan looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own feelings. He too understood that we were standing on the edge, that every step could lead to disaster. But neither of us was ready to stop. "I know," he said, his hand lightly touching mine. The touch was so soft, but it made my heart race faster. "But I can't do otherwise. You're all I think about." Those words hit me straight in the heart. I closed my eyes, trying to manage the flood of emotions. I understood that I had already gone too far, that there was no turning back. We continued meeting. Our secret encounters became something essential for both of us, something that gave us both meaning. We began taking bigger and bigger risks, knowing that one mistake could ruin everything. But we couldn't stop. Declan became more persistent. He started finding any excuse to see me, even if it was the shortest and most insignificant of meetings. One day, he suggested we meet in the evening at the beach. It was a place we had never been to before, a place where we could stay in silence, away from prying eyes. I agreed, knowing that each of these meetings was pulling me deeper into this abyss. When I arrived at the beach, the sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Declan was waiting for me on the shore. His figure was dark against the backdrop of the sunset, but I knew it was him. I walked closer, and he turned to face me, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. "You're here!" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried so much strength that I felt something inside me turn over once again. "Yes," I replied, stepping closer, and in that moment, our gazes met once more. We stood there on the empty beach, in a silence that felt unbearably loud. Everything happening around us lost its significance. It was just us and this strange pull that left us no choice. He stepped toward me, and his arms wrapped around my waist. The gesture felt so natural that I barely even registered it. In the next moment, our lips met again, and I plunged into that kiss with such passion as if it were our last chance. We knew that these meetings couldn't last forever, that sooner or later it would all have to end. But as long as we had this moment, we couldn't let it go. Every time I returned home after meeting Declan, a wave of guilt would wash over me. I would step into the house where everything felt so familiar. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of the TV in the living room, Grayson's steady breathing at night. But now all of it felt foreign. There was a shadow in my life that I couldn't dispel: my betrayal. With each passing day, the guilt grew stronger. I looked at Grayson, who continued living his ordinary life, suspecting nothing, and it felt like there was a deep chasm between us. He was the same to me as he had always been, but everything inside me had changed. Every dinner we shared, every conversation in the kitchen, every quiet evening in front of the TV reminded me of how deeply I had betrayed him. Yet, despite all of this, I couldn't stop meeting Declan. The passion that tied us together was too powerful. Every time we were alone, all my inner turmoil would vanish. It was just the two of us and a feeling that was no longer possible to control. I tried to lead a double life, to hide my infidelity, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. My lies were becoming more elaborate, and I concocted excuses to sneak away for meetings with Declan, trying to keep Grayson from suspecting anything. But the more I lied, the harder it became to live in this world of deceit. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, I noticed Grayson looking at me intently. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, and there was a note of concern in his voice. My heart clenched. Was he starting to suspect something? I quickly tried to conceal my unease. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though inside I was tightening with fear. "I don't know. You've been distant. Sometimes it feels like you're not really here with me. Are you thinking about something else?" His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I knew he was right. I really wasn't with him. My thoughts were elsewhere, with Declan, and I couldn't hide it. "I've just been tired. There's a lot going on at work, and the training is exhausting," I replied, hoping the explanation would be enough. Grayson nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. It was only a matter of time before he started asking more questions. And that terrified me. I continued seeing Declan, but now every encounter was shadowed by fear. I was afraid that Grayson would find out the truth, that my lies would come to light. Inside, I was constantly battling between duty and desire. My conscience tormented me more and more, but each time I saw Declan, none of it seemed to matter. We met again at the same cafe outside of town where no one knew us. Declan was sitting at the same table by the window when I walked in. His gaze, as always, was filled with passion and something irresistibly alluring. I sat down across from him, and our eyes met. "You look tense," he said, leaning in closer. "Is everything all right?" I sighed, trying to find the right words, but they got stuck in my throat. Everything I could say felt hollow. "It's all getting too complicated," I finally whispered, not breaking eye contact. Declan was silent for a few seconds, but I could see that he understood me. "Do you want to stop?" he asked quietly, and his words were filled with sadness. I knew it would be the right thing to do. I knew that if we didn't stop now, it would end in disaster, but I couldn't. My heart was torn between what was right and what I truly wanted. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I can't keep living like this." Declan reached out and touched my hand. That simple touch made my heart race all over again. "I don't want to lose you, Lainey." His voice was quiet, but full of determination. "I'm willing to do anything to be with you." Those words pierced me to the core. I knew he was being sincere, but I also knew there was no happy ending to this story. We were both trapped by our feelings, and there was no way out. When I came home after that meeting, Grayson was already asleep. I quietly slipped into the bedroom and lay down next to him. I watched his face, his peaceful sleep, and I realized that time was running out. My double life was about to crumble like a house of cards. The next day, I tried to act normal, but it was unbearable. Every movement he made, every word he said, reminded me of how deeply I had betrayed him. I felt worse with each passing day, but the passion I had for Declan was too strong to just end it. Recently, I've been noticing how Grayson looks at me with a certain tense focus. His gaze was no longer the familiar calm I had grown used to. He was studying me as if trying to figure out what exactly had changed in our lives. Every time he spoke to me, there was a hint of uncertainty and wariness in his voice. I could see that he was starting to suspect something. Maybe his intuition was telling him that something was wrong, that our marriage was beginning to fall apart. One evening, after another workout, I came home and found Grayson in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, staring into a cup of cold tea. I felt a spiral of anxiety tighten inside me. He was too quiet, and that scared me. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled. I was afraid that he had already figured it out. "Hi," he replied, without lifting his eyes from the cup. "How was the workout?" The question sounded so routine, but there was something new in his tone. I felt the tension between us growing. My heart was racing, and I knew I would soon have to face the truth. "Good, as always," I quickly responded, hoping that would be enough. But Grayson looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the concern he was trying to hide. I realized that he was no longer satisfied with surface-level answers. "Lainey." His voice was quiet, but there was more strength in it than I had expected. "You haven't been yourself lately. You've been distant, nervous. What's going on?" The question felt like a punch to the heart. I knew this moment was inevitable. He could feel that something was wrong, and now he wanted answers. But I couldn't tell him. I couldn't admit that I had been lying to him all this time, that I had someone else. My throat tightened, and I just stood there, speechless, not knowing what to say. Lainey, I can't do this anymore. I feel you pulling away, and I want to understand why. If something's wrong, tell me. We can fix it. His voice grew more insistent, but I could hear the desperation in it. I looked away, trying to hide the tears that were already welling up. My guilt overwhelmed me again. I had betrayed the man who had always been by my side, who had always supported me, and now I stood in front of him, unable to tell him the truth. Everything's fine, Grayson. It's just work, workouts, exhaustion. I'm just tired, that's all. My voice was as weak as my excuse, but I was too afraid to say anything more. It's not just exhaustion. His voice dropped even lower, but there was firmness in it. I see that something's wrong between us. I can feel you distancing yourself. We hardly spend any time together. If something happened, I need to know. I couldn't take it any longer. My hands started to shake, and I felt the tears rising. I turned away so he wouldn't see how much it was tearing me apart inside. I knew I couldn't hide the truth for much longer. Our relationship was hanging by a thread, and Grayson knew it. He wanted answers, but I couldn't give them to him. Lainey, please tell me the truth. His voice was full of pain. I couldn't stand there any longer. I quickly left the kitchen, feeling the tears spilling over. My guilt was unbearable, but I knew that if I told him the truth, I would lose everything. I couldn't confess. I couldn't break his heart. When I locked myself in the bathroom, I leaned over the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My smile in the reflection seemed foreign. I didn't know who I had become. Every day, every moment was filled with lies. I was living a double life, and it was tearing me apart. I realized that I would have to make a choice soon. Grayson could no longer tolerate my silence, and I knew this conversation was just the beginning. If I didn't confess to him myself, the truth would come out eventually. But if I chose Declan, could I live with that? Could I destroy the marriage that Grayson and I had built over the years for the feelings I had for another man? I returned to the bedroom late at night when Grayson was already asleep. Lying next to him, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. What should I do? Leave things as they are, hoping I could keep everything under control? Or tell Grayson the truth, risking losing it all? My life was on the verge of collapse, and I knew the next step would be decisive. I had to make a choice, but that choice felt unbearable. Each meeting with Declan brought me relief and the passion I had long lost in my marriage. But every time I returned home, I felt like a monster. At that moment, I realized I couldn't continue this for much longer. The day everything changed, I thought it would be just another ordinary meeting. Declan and I had agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where no one knew us. This place had become our refuge, where we could hide from the world and from the problems that surrounded us every day. I arrived early and sat at our usual table. As always, the waiting was filled with tension. I couldn't relax, even though my meetings with Declan had become routine by now. My heart still beat faster every time I saw him. When he arrived, I smiled, but I felt uneasy inside. Recently, my fears and guilt had grown stronger. I knew I was living on a ticking time bomb, and sooner or later it was going to explode. But at that moment, I tried not to think about it. We sat together, talking about everyday things as if everything was normal, but it was far from it. And then, in one of those moments when I turned to look out the window, I saw a familiar face. It was one of Grayson's acquaintances, someone I had seen before at parties and gatherings with his friends. My heart stopped instantly, and in that moment, I knew we had been seen. Lainey! Declan's voice snapped me out of my stupor, but I couldn't listen to him anymore. Everything around me turned into a blur of noise. We need to leave, I whispered, quickly standing up. Panic started to rise, and I felt a cold sweat running down my spine. What happened? He asked, noticing the sudden change in my reaction. He saw us. I nodded towards the man, who was still sitting at his table, but his gaze was fixed right on us. He's one of Grayson's friends. Declan understood immediately. He stood up quickly and gently placed his arms around my shoulders, trying to calm me. We'll get out of here, he said, but his calm couldn't quell my rising panic. We hurried out of the cafe, trying not to draw any more attention to ourselves. But inside, everything was boiling over. My head was spinning with thoughts of what would happen next. The truth could come out now. This was the end. My affair with Declan was in danger of being exposed, and I couldn't stop the overwhelming fear. Once we were in the car, I couldn't hold back the tears. I leaned forward, burying my face in my hands, and all my anxiety poured out. What do we do now? He's going to tell Grayson, I'm sure, I said, trembling with fear. Declan gently touched my hand, his voice calm but resolute. Lainey, calm down. I know you're scared, but we have a way out. What way out? Everything is ruined, I almost shouted, feeling the panic take over. Declan looked at me, his expression serious. We can leave, Lainey, together, far away from all of this. We can start over, somewhere where no one knows us. I froze at his suggestion. It sounded insane. Leave? Leave everything behind? I couldn't believe that was the solution. But at the same time, something inside me responded to his words. My exhaustion from constant lies, from living a double life, pushed me towards the thought that this could be the answer. Leave? I repeated, barely believing what I was hearing. Yes, he confirmed. We still have time. We can leave all of this behind. You don't have to live in fear and guilt anymore. I don't want to see you suffer. I couldn't believe my ears. Declan was offering me a chance to leave everything, my life, my husband, everything I knew, to run away with him. It was tempting, yet terrifying. I can't just leave, I said, still confused. Grayson, he doesn't deserve this. Lainey, if you stay, it's only going to get worse. You won't be able to hide this any longer. And if he finds out the truth, you'll lose everything anyway. His voice was firm but filled with care. I knew he was right. If the truth came out, I would destroy everything I had with Grayson. But running away? Leaving it all behind? It seemed too radical. I wasn't ready. I can't make that decision right now, I whispered, avoiding his gaze. Declan squeezed my hand tighter, his voice softening. I won't rush you, but remember, we have this option, and I'll always be here for you. We drove in silence, my thoughts swirling like a storm. Now I faced a choice that would shape the rest of my life. Run away with Declan and start fresh, leaving behind the shattered relationship with Grayson, or go home and try to hide the truth, knowing that it might soon become impossible. My life was falling apart, and I was standing at a crossroads. All night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were like tangled threads, which I tried to unravel, but the more I tried, the tighter they became. I lay in bed next to Grayson, his breathing soft and steady. He had no idea about the storm that was raging inside me. I watched his face in the dim light and felt a wave of guilt rising within me, growing stronger with each passing day. I was faced with a choice I could no longer postpone. Declan had made it clear that we had a chance to leave together, to start over far away from this town, from my lies, from Grayson. This choice seemed both tempting and terrifying. Leaving with Declan meant abandoning my entire previous life, everything I had built with Grayson over the years. It meant destroying everything we had shared for the sake of a passion I could no longer control. But on the other hand, every time I thought about Declan, my heart skipped a beat. I knew what I felt for him wasn't just a fleeting infatuation. It was much deeper. He awakened something in me that I had long lost, something that made me feel alive. I knew that with him, my life would be full of passion and unpredictability. But was I ready for that? I realized that if I chose Declan, I would destroy Grayson. He would never be able to understand why I had betrayed him, as he didn't see what I felt. To him, our marriage was stability and love. But for me, it was something far more complex. I had always loved Grayson, but over the years, our love had turned into routine, into habit. I had lost the spark we once had, and when Declan came into my life, I felt alive again. But was it worth it? Was passion worth destroying my life? These questions swirled in my mind as I quietly left the bedroom, careful not to wake Grayson. I headed to the kitchen and sat at the table, clutching a cup of hot tea. My gaze was distant as I searched for answers that seemed impossible to find. At that moment, I realized that I had to make a choice that would change my life forever. I could no longer live a double life, lying to Grayson while being with Declan. This had to end. But how? When I met Declan the next day, I knew I had to tell him something decisive. We sat on the same beach where we had spent time together not long ago. This time, his gaze was serious, and I could see the same tension in his eyes that I felt within myself. "Have you made up your mind?" His voice was quiet, but there was determination in it. I couldn't answer right away. My mind was filled with thoughts of what I could lose and what I could gain if I chose him. Everything was too confusing. I don't know," I whispered finally, feeling my heart tighten with fear. Declan nodded, but I could see that his patience was wearing thin. He wanted to be with me, but I knew he wouldn't wait forever. In his eyes, I could see that he was ready to walk away if I didn't choose him. "Lainey, I understand this is hard for you, but you have to make a choice. You can't go on like this. Neither I nor Grayson deserve that," he said, his voice turning slightly firmer. He was right. I couldn't hide behind lies any longer. I had to make this choice, even if it would destroy everything. "I know," I said, meeting his gaze. "But it's hard. Grayson, he doesn't deserve what I've done. And I don't know if I can throw everything away for what we have. Are you willing to continue living with him, knowing your feelings for him have changed?" Declan didn't break eye contact. That question hit me harder than I expected. I really couldn't go back to my old life, pretending nothing had happened. I had changed. My feelings toward Grayson had changed. Our marriage would never be the same as it once was. But could I throw everything away for Declan? Could I believe that our passion would be the foundation for a new life? "Declan, I can't give you an answer right now. I need time to figure out what I really want," I said, feeling my thoughts getting more tangled. "I won't rush you, Lainey," his voice softened, "but I can't wait forever." We fell silent. The air was thick with tension, and I realized that this moment was pivotal. I had to choose between the stability and familiarity of my life with Grayson and the passion I felt for Declan. This choice was unbearably difficult, and I knew that whatever I decided, there would be consequences. When I returned home, Grayson was sitting on the couch, watching the news. He looked so calm and sure of himself, and seeing him like that made me feel guilty all over again. I knew that if I chose Declan, I would shatter his world. But I also knew that if I stayed with Grayson, I could never forget Declan. In that moment, I realized that no matter what choice I made, I would lose something important. I always feared the day when everything would come to light. I dreaded that moment when all my lies would be exposed, and I would have to face the consequences of my actions. But I never thought that moment would come so soon and so suddenly. When I returned home that evening, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Grayson was waiting for me in the kitchen. He sat at the table, arms crossed, his face closed off and cold. I felt a vague sense of dread rising inside me, as if something inevitable was approaching. He didn't greet me, didn't even look in my direction. He just sat there in complete silence. I knew something serious had happened. "Grayson?" I called to him, trying to understand what was going on. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His gaze was heavy, filled with pain and disappointment. The moment seemed to stretch on forever until I finally heard his next words. "I know." Those two words pierced through me like a dagger. My heart clenched, and I felt everything inside me turn upside down. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I knew the answer was already obvious. All my fears had become reality. "Know about what?" I weakly whispered, though deep down, I knew there was no point in pretending anymore. "About you and your lover." His voice was firm, but beneath it, I could hear the deep hurt. "One of my friends saw you together, saw you kissing." My head started spinning. Time seemed to freeze, and I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Everything I had feared was now staring me in the face. There was no going back. "Grayson," I began, but I couldn't find the words. What could I say? How could I explain my actions, my betrayal? "Why?" His voice broke into a shout, and I flinched in surprise. "Why did you do it? We've been together for so many years, and you've destroyed everything. Why?" I felt the tears start to fall down my cheeks. I couldn't hold them back any longer. I knew I had to confess. There was no point in lying anymore. "I don't know," I whispered, feeling each word cut deeper and deeper. It was something I couldn't control. I don't know why it went this far. Grayson stared at me, his face twisted with pain and anger. He couldn't understand how everything we had could fall apart so quickly and unexpectedly. You cheated on me, Lainey. You betrayed us, betrayed everything we built. How could you?" His voice was quieter now, but the desperation in it was undeniable. I couldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, feeling my life crumble before my eyes. I knew my words would change nothing now. Everything was lost. "Leave," he suddenly said, his words like a final judgment. "Grayson, wait!" I tried to find some excuse, some explanation, but he didn't give me a chance. "Leave, Lainey," he repeated, his voice filled with finality. "I don't want to see you anymore. You've destroyed everything." I felt my world collapse. He didn't want me anymore. He had thrown me out, and that was the final end. I couldn't stay here any longer, couldn't keep fighting for something that had already been destroyed. I quietly left the kitchen, heading to the bedroom to pack my things. My head was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them could explain how I had allowed this to happen, how I had ruined my life for a passion that turned out to be so destructive. When I left the house, Grayson didn't come out to see me off. He stayed in the kitchen, not wanting to look at me ever again. I realized then that there was no turning back. Everything we had was destroyed in an instant. I drove away, not knowing what would come next. When I left Grayson's house that night, I knew there was no turning back. He had made a decision that marked the final point for both of us. His forgiveness was out of reach, and I knew that our past would remain only a memory. Soon after, he filed for divorce, and it became official. The marriage we had built over the years crumbled like a house of cards. At first, it felt surreal. I was with Declan, but I felt lost. We started building a new life together, but it wasn't as easy as I had imagined. Now, I no longer lived in a house with a cozy kitchen, familiar surroundings, and all the little things that had made life with Grayson feel stable. Instead, I found myself in a new reality, full of passion and tension, but without the certainty that my previous life had given me. Declan rented a small apartment on the other side of town. We had been living together for a few weeks, and every morning I woke up next to him, feeling mixed emotions. On the one hand, it was freedom, freedom from guilt, from lies, from the tension I felt when I was living with Grayson. But on the other hand, I felt empty. Nothing in this new life was turning out the way I had pictured. "We'll make it," Declan would say confidently every time he noticed my mood. "We'll have everything you want, Lainey. I'm ready to do anything for you." His words sounded sincere, and I wanted to believe them. Declan really was trying, but the situation felt more complicated than I could have expected. Now that the romance of our secret meetings was gone, only reality remained. We weren't hiding anymore, and that sense of freedom should have been exhilarating. But instead, I felt somewhat lost. Every day, I tried to find something in this new life to hold on to. Declan and I spent a lot of time together. He tried to surround me with care and attention, but sometimes I found myself thinking about the foundation Grayson and I had shared. Everything now felt temporary, as if every step we took was uncertain. "Do you regret it?" Declan asked me one night while we were having dinner together. The question caught me off guard. I froze, holding a fork in my hand, feeling a tightness inside me. "Regret what?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "Choosing me," he said, his voice calm, but I could tell that the question weighed on him more than he wanted to show. I lowered my gaze to the plate, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I didn't know. My decision had destroyed my marriage, my former life, but I wasn't sure it had made me happy. I felt free, but at the same time, lost. "I don't know," I finally replied honestly, looking up at him. "I can't say I regret it, but it feels like I've lost more than I expected." Declan froze, tension tightening his face, but he didn't argue. "I know it's hard for you," he said after a brief pause. "But we can build something new, Lainey. I believe in that." His words were meant to give me confidence, but they felt like promises I couldn't fully accept. I knew that life with Declan, though filled with passion, couldn't replace the stability I had lost. Every day I woke up with the thought that I needed to move forward, but the past kept pulling me back. Grayson was no longer part of my life, but I still thought about him. It hurt knowing that I had caused him so much pain, and that feeling wouldn't let me go. Life with Declan was new, fresh, but it didn't bring the peace I so desperately craved. I realized that the infatuation, which had started with a small spark of passion, had led to the destruction of everything that had once been precious. Now I was faced with the challenge of figuring out whether I could build something real with Declan, or if this passion would eventually fade away, just like everything else had before. Months passed, and my life with Declan gradually turned into something completely different from what I had imagined. In the beginning, when we had just started living together, everything felt new and exciting. We cherished every moment, and the passion that connected us was intense. But as time went on, everything began to change. Our life became routine, and the passion that once seemed endless slowly faded. I always knew that passion couldn't last forever. It was a law of nature, but I had hoped that there would be something more between Declan and me, something that would keep us together. Yet, with each passing day, I realized more and more that our relationship was built on fleeting emotions, on that very passion that was now rapidly disappearing. We started facing what we had avoided during our secret encounters: everyday life. Routine tasks began to occupy more space in our lives. We no longer met in secret, no longer indulged in moments of forbidden desire. Now we had an ordinary life, filled with mundane problems, responsibilities, and work. And I realized that all of it was consuming us. Each day began the same. We woke up, had breakfast, and went our separate ways. In the evenings, we returned home, barely exchanging a few words. We no longer talked the way we used to, and a silence hung between us. One evening, after another day full of ordinary tasks, I realized I no longer felt that energy that had connected us in the beginning. Declan sat across from me, his eyes tired, and I knew he felt the same. We both remained silent, as if we didn't know what to say to each other. Our conversations had become shallow, and the romance that once filled every moment had now vanished. "Lainey," he suddenly said, breaking the silence. I looked up at him, knowing that this conversation had been brewing for a long time. "What?" I replied, trying to avoid meeting his gaze. "We both know this isn't working." His voice was quiet but firm. I knew he was right. Our life together, built on passion and instant attraction, couldn't withstand the weight of reality. Now that we lived together, reality had become too heavy for both of us. "I know," I whispered, feeling something tighten inside me. Declan sighed, and I saw the exhaustion in his eyes that we had both been hiding all this time. "We're not who we used to be. It's all gone, Lainey. I thought I could build a life with you, but I think we were both fooling ourselves." His words were painful, but true. I felt that this was the end of our dream, the end of what had seemed so right at first. The passion that had connected us had faded, and in its place was only emptiness. "I can't do this anymore," Declan said, his voice full of regret. "We tried, but it's not working." "You're right," I replied, feeling a wave of sadness rising inside me. I wanted to hold on to our relationship, but I knew it was impossible. We were no longer the people who had once left everything behind for the sake of passion. We had become an ordinary couple, swallowed by routine. And in that routine, there was no room left for the love we had hoped to preserve. Soon after that conversation, we made the decision to part ways. It was inevitable. We didn't argue, didn't shout at each other. We simply and quietly acknowledged that our paths had diverged. I packed my things and moved to another apartment, knowing that this chapter of my life had come to an end. Looking back now, I realized that I had destroyed my marriage for a passion that turned out to be temporary. My life with Grayson had been stable, but I was searching for something more. I found that with Declan, but in doing so, I lost the very stability I had taken for granted. In the end, all of my decisions led me to this point. Alone, without my husband, and without the fire that had once connected me to Declan. After I left Declan and found myself in a new, empty apartment, a wave of realization washed over me. In the silence, surrounded by bare walls and loneliness, I understood the fatal mistake I had made. That fling, which once seemed exciting and passionate, had now destroyed everything I had with Grayson. Thousands of questions swirled in my mind. How could I? Why didn't I stop in time? There were no answers, only the agonizing weight of regret. Every day I woke up with a growing sense of emptiness. My life with Grayson had been far from perfect, but was that really a reason to destroy it for a fleeting infatuation? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had thrown everything away for a momentary passion that eventually faded, leaving behind nothing but ashes. I had thought that my relationship with Declan would change me, that it would give me what I was missing in my marriage to Grayson. But it was a mistake, a huge mistake that couldn't be undone. My mind was consumed with thoughts of how things could have been different. If only I had just talked to Grayson, if we had been able to openly discuss our problems, maybe we could have saved our marriage. I knew our relationship had become routine, that the passion we once had was gone. But instead of working on it, I chose the path of least resistance, escaping into the arms of another man who offered me what I thought I was lacking. Now, looking back, I realized it had all been an illusion. Every night as I lay in bed, I was tormented by thoughts of how things could have been if I had acted differently. Instead of seeking something new on the side, Grayson and I just needed to spend more time together. Conversations, walks, maybe even small trips. All of that could have brought back the connection I had let slip away so easily. Perhaps I just needed to talk to him honestly, without fear or shame, to tell him about my feelings, about what was troubling me. But now that was impossible. Grayson had filed for divorce, and our relationship was shattered. I would never be able to get back the time I had lost. I would never be able to make amends for the hurt I caused him. Every thought of what I could have fixed tormented me even more. I could no longer live under the illusion that passion and novelty could replace years of shared life and trust. My life had turned into a continuous stream of regrets and self-reproach. I had lost not only my husband, but also a part of myself. If I could go back, I would do everything differently. I would have stopped the moment I felt myself losing control. I would have talked to Grayson, found the time to discuss our issues, and tried to save what we had built together over the years. But instead, I chose the easy path, the path of passion and infatuation, which ultimately destroyed my life. My advice to those standing on the verge of such decisions: don't make my mistake. Never place fleeting emotions above what truly matters. Love, trust, and even routine are not things to run away from. They are things to cherish and fight for. An honest conversation can save more than you think.